Okay, so thank you guys all for coming. This was kind of one of those spontaneous moments. I'll tell you about like the origin of this particular conversation, which is that like a week and a half ago, I had a client that I had been seeing for a little over a year who had gotten discharged over a year ago from a residential alcohol program and detox facility that she had spent a couple of months at. And I started working with her, and I did kind of the normal thing that I do when I start working with folks, especially who have just come out of treatment, which is that I start really reframing their experience, both in the treatment and in themselves within my kind of more master framework for addiction, oppression, and what I call the movement of the field of existence. And so it usually takes me somewhere between 3 months to a year to really get most of the shame to exit people's bodies and being through this kind of continual reframing that I do. And it depends on what their experience has been in treatment, what their experience has been with other clinicians, all kinds of things, what their exposure has been to the regular system. So last week, this individual had something pretty tragic happen, and they wound up drinking for a few days. And when I saw them on the other side of that, they were already in the same conversational speak around like relapse and around badness and around self harming, even though nothing was really overtly happening, but it was really happening on the inside. And I found myself becoming really, really, really angry. And not really angry at my client, but really angry at the fact that they had like called their sponsor, and the framework their sponsor was using was very much around like, you've relapsed, like, just remember that you're an alcoholic, like the kind of typical things that we do. And so two things came up in me. One, I was really angry and very, very sad. And the second thing that came up is I started feeling incredibly helpless. And I had one of the few moments that I have of being in recognition of what I was up against as far as like the accepted ways that we think about, frame, and view and aim in traditional treatment and care. And so that was kind of the impetus for this talk today. And I always try to be pretty diplomatic about the care world. One, because I've been in it, I spent years in it, decades in it. I know it's filled with incredibly good people and people who are really there, many of them to like try and do the right thing, and they are just as frustrated as everybody else. But the other reason I think I try to be diplomatic is that I don't think that where things are moving from is coming, at least not from providers and from people who own systems. It's not coming from a bad place, but it is coming from a deeply limited and lack of informed place. And so it's kind of like if you've only ever known 10 types of food and somebody gives you 30, and you've known the 10 types of food for like 16 generations, you're going to be like, no, I see the 30, but there's really only 10. And there's also really only 10 that work. And the thing that's really interesting is that the only 10 that work is exactly what I just said, is exactly the same stance that patients are in when they come for addiction. Is that they have also gotten unbelievably falsely narrowed, and they have come to accept that narrowing as true. They've come to embody that narrowing on a cellular level. And they have then embraced that kind of partial imprisonment as the truth of their beinghood and then gone on to defend it. And so, one of the things that I've been kind of arguing against for so long is that it's kind of like the treatment systems are the parent. Now, they're not really the parent, and I'm not in any way saying that you should go be dependent on a treatment system because you've missed parenting. But it is true that they're putting themselves in a role of a kind of authority. And we go to them in places when we are incredibly vulnerable and when we are like have lost the shores of our being, and we are seeking somebody who can hold the framework of that shore. And if the person or the system holding that framework is just as lost as us about what the shore is, where it's located, and actually how big the ocean is, we're in some deep trouble. And when I started talking about this stuff in 2010, when I opened the clinic, back then we didn't really recognize as a group or as a collective how limited and poor the care circuit was. In 2010, people were still really bought in a totally different way than they are now 14 years later. And so what we're seeing is more and more people who are leaving traditional care and even practitioners within care. So I don't want to just say clients, but psychiatrists, physicians. Well, psychiatrists are physicians, but regular MDs, primary care physicians, nurse practitioners, and like other kinds of providers, psychiatrists, psychologists, all of that. But what's interesting is that the trend that is happening is that as a substitute for care, people are seeking out more holistic or kind of what we call fringy or contemplative practices. And the tricky thing is that the same limitation is living there. So it may not look exactly the same, but because we have all been kind of boiled in the same reductionist pot, every single system is still working in an incredibly limited frame. And so what you find is that you as a client or as a person seeking help, you have to carry the onus of sorting through where each of those limited frames can offer you something and where they can't. So this is okay for kind of high functioning folks. But when you're in real activation and in a trauma episode or in like lifelong chronic fracturing, or you're in underprivileged systems within our society, you are shit out of luck because you don't really have the capacity to hold all of that or do the investigation or the fighting with insurance companies or any of the other layers. And so therein is these incredibly fractal baked in double binds. And this is why we have an entire collective that is situated in a place in which they feel like they're drowning. They are deeply somewhat helpless. And they are basically living in mostly compensation for that drowning and helplessness, even the high functioning folks, and even the ones with lots of money, and sometimes especially those people. So I want to say that because we tend to only think about certain sectors as having the least privilege in care, but in some ways it's just different circumstances or different conditions within each. And it all boils down to the fact that in general, care has become so formulaic and so distilled into methodology and so narrowed into what is paid for and what is measurably justified that we have taken a thing that should be gigantic and full of art and attunement, and we have boiled it down to a kind of every year replaceable romance novel where like the characters change, but the subject matter is still exactly the same. So for people who fall outside of like the linear based fixing pieces, right? These are like what the care system does pretty well. You have an ailment, there's a way to trace it back. They can come up with the medicine or the remedy or the technique, and like one circumstance can be ameliorated. But for everything else, which is pretty much almost everything, at least in mental health and bleeding over into like chronic pain, fibromyalgia, inflammation, all of these things, which includes things like dementia as well, right? Gut health, hormone health. None of these things fit any of the typical care protocol that we have. And so what we have as our backup pretty much is medication. It's basically like, well, if you don't really know it, or if it seems idiopathic, we're going to see if we can medicate it. Or we're going to shuffle you from provider to provider, and they're all going to say, but it's that guy, but it's that guy, but it's that guy. But what I want to say is that the accountability should stop being so high on the people who are struggling and don't have the education. And the accountability should start to shift to not only the places that we provide care, but the kind of education that we are providing for care. Because that's the feeder system, right? Somebody asked me 4 years ago, they were like, you could make so much money if you just taught your model to like as many people that wanted to learn it. Like just like IFS, like you could scale it just like that. And you could like train thousands of people all over the world. And I said, that's true, but I'm unwilling to do that because there's nowhere for them to work. And I have the intellectual property for where those people should be working. And so to me, it's like you go up the food chain to create kind of the downstream effect as high up as you can go. And essentially, the way the systems are structured is also limiting the people, even the ones who have really good education and really good ways of working. In addition to that, even if you are the most kick-ass provider, you won't know it all. And there will be methods of intervention and medicines that you can't deliver because they are not in your wheelhouse. And so it's really essential too that we have places where cooperative multidisciplinary care is offered, and not just as an adjacent thing or an extra, where like, oh, the medical doctors and the psychologists and like the accepted forms of care, which is basically the ones we pay for, right? Everything that is accepted is what insurance pays for. But that not only those forms of care are considered the primary movers, but that the other forms of intervention, which might not look like care at all, but might look like something else, some other form of attending to the many dimensions that that system is in at that moment. Sometimes people come in and the first thing that they need is help with their impoverishment. Or they need help learning how to like make a meal for themselves. That has to come before long-term psychotherapy in some cases. Most of the time people come to me looking for well, they don't anymore, thank God. But they used to come to me looking for psychotherapy, and I had to break the news to them that they weren't ready for psychotherapy because they needed body work first. But then they have to pay out of pocket for that. And so where are they going to be able to pay out of pocket for that? And so these are kind of the problems that I've been sitting with for almost 2 decades and trying to figure out, how do we build a system? How do we build a model that is scalable, that takes into account all of these variables, and that does not leave anybody out? Because the reality is this model can't just be for some people. Because if some other people are left out, we're all left out. Because no one's like getting there alone without the others. Like that's an illusion. So I know that we talk a lot about the need for all of these things, but I think that one of the things I wanted to speak about today is the real possibility of them occurring. So I think that what happens for most of us is we see the issue, we feel the issue, we have inklings about how to solve the problem, but we run up against that same futility bind that is present because it's present for any of us who are trying to make significant moves in this world. Because the world is set up to prohibit that movement. So you can say things like, I'm not a white man with tons of money. And that's true, but it's set up to prohibit some of even his movement too. No one is left out of that either. So I'm going to say that one of the things that I have been left with, and after all of these years of distilling all of this information, both in addictions, systemic oppression, in the double bind, and in the scalability and widespread need for a model that is relational, developmental, and rooted in honesty, there is one thing that I keep coming back to. And if we can just shift our awareness towards this one thing, it will change the view in the way we move through things, the way we access care, and in the ways that we expect care to provide for us, because that is also really important. Every one of us is a care customer on some level. And so what we expect care to provide for us deeply influences the kind of care that is offered. And that is existence. So conceptually, existence is this kind of metaphysical or holographic ideology that maybe we think about as this thing that is spiritual or a kind of attainment or a conceptual understanding of what we are. But on a tangible level, existence is our perception of our efficacy, power, capacity, range, acceptance, and belonging. And so when you think about those words and those particular attributes, and you understand that those are all descriptors of the experience of existing, then you begin to understand how existence is the primary thing that is leveraged in an oppressive or an abusive system. And that in that leveraging, not just in one place, but in multiple places, we develop this widespread body within us of not only invisibility and non-existence, but worthlessness and futility. And underneath that, deep helplessness and apathy. That's what care should be working on. And if care is only working on the things that are downstream from that, like an empowerment program, for example, or a way for you to contact your own self-confidence, or for you to visualize yourself in a better place, those things can be useful at certain phases, but unless it goes past those phases into the deeper layers of fundamental non-existence that every one of us has had exposure to, and every one of us has had exposure to that at a different range and percentage. That range and percentage is deeply important in understanding how trauma is going to play out in you, how it will or not resolve, how addiction will be in partnership with trauma, how it will or not resolve, and what things that you access in order to make things better for you or don't. Those are the algorithms we need to be using. Those are the measurables that will allow us to create and scale care in a way in which its efficacy runs deep and creates more access to vitality and honesty. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to spend the rest of their life calling themselves an addict and going to 12-step programs because that's the only thing they can do. And in no way am I saying that those things don't have a place, don't have efficacy, and that we should get rid of them. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a land behind and in front of them. And we're not looking at the land behind or in front. And so as a result, we have said to people, this is all you've got. And they have made themselves smaller to be able to fit that range, and the reducing of their energetic, psychological, and emotional soul body to fit that frame has a massive cost. So I'll give you guys an example. I was with somebody who I saw one time this week, and this individual had struggled with a lot of years of addiction. He's been in remission for a long time, but he's still struggling in his system with honesty and vitality in a way that feels congruent. He's also done a ton of spiritual practices. And he's like, why have I done all these things and I still am not feeling the thing? So where we went was directly to the origin of the thing that he needs to feel, which is essentially the place of emptiness and the terror that lives right on the top of that emptiness. And so once we got to the terror, he did what everybody does, which is he left. Because you kind of, when you get to the terror, you get repelled outside of it. So he got to the terror, he touched it, and then he was just gone. And I was like, okay, no, we're going back again. And he's looking at me like, you're a terrible Dom. And I was like, okay, but we're going back again. So we went back again. So we went back like 5 times because I'm mean like that. And so we went back and he was like, what the fuck is this? And I was like, this is reality. And he was like, wait a second. And there was like this moment of dawning that happened for him. And a few minutes later, I was like, the energy had changed. And I was like, okay, go back again. And he went back again and he's like, wait, there's only peace here. And I was like, mm-hmm. And he's like, wait, all those other things that I'm doing, they're just to cope with that. And I was like, mm-hmm. And he was like, wait. He was like, there's like billions of them. And I was like, mm-hmm. And he was like, oh shit, how do you do that? And I was like, mm-hmm. And so it was like, this is the thing, you guys. Like, if you're going to stay in the 10,000 other things, if our care system is going to masturbate in the 10,000 other things and call it treatment, no one is ever going to move the needle. Like, that's just the reality of it. Because the way reality itself is structured is that if you stay on the outside rings of it, like Saturn, if you stay on the outside rings of it, you're never going to touch the center. And your being is always going to yearn for the damn center because the center is where your belonging is. And it doesn't matter how many times people are like pointing to the other ring and you spend a lot of money to go to the other ring and visit it and be like, hey, it's so cool over here. There's a party, people are awesome, and they're doing psychedelics in this ring. And it doesn't matter because the reality is, until you touch that place for yourself with sobriety, until that happens, you won't really know. You'll just be imagining. And to me, this is so naturally what we should be doing in care. Like, why would we be doing anything else? And that if we're not doing this, then what are we really doing and why the hell are we doing it? And what's driving it? Because on some level, we're all accepting it, right? We're all accepting that reality frame because we feel helpless to change it. Yeah, sobriety from the model is basically just in naked honesty. So, sobriety just means that you're approaching the thing without agenda for it or for yourself, and that there is enough collapsing of all of the defensive structures that when you get there, it can sense you and you can sense it. In many spiritual traditions, it's like what we call presence, but it's not manufactured. It's simply a function of getting more naked. Okay. So the question too is like, how do the systems do something with sobriety? Right? How do they get more naked? So on some level, this requires practitioners within those systems to have a training manual that helps them with getting naked. But it also requires us to have a frame in our measuring and our assessing of the efficacy of treatment that leads with the unknown. It leads with the curious and with nothing left out. So generally, we have assumptions that we use for measurement, and those assumptions that we're using for measurement generally leave out certain things as being unmeasurable, more fringy, too metaphysical, not evidence-based. And so we're leaving out a whole way that people's bodies, that the many bodies within an individual are actually attuned to and within. And the leaving out of that attunement puts more energy and attention on the other bodies that we are paying attention to. And essentially, we're keeping the balance off and incomplete. Asked, how do you know the baseline of sobriety? So, the easiest way to test sobriety is responsiveness. So, in general, innocence will not respond if it's not in the presence of sobriety. Innocence will shut down, it will turn away, it will defend, it will run, it will dissociate. Any of those things that we see that we often actually label as resistance in care. And many of the reasons that people seem to be in resistance is that they are not being met with that sobriety. That their honesty is not being met with honesty. And their temperature or meter for honesty is very strong. And so as a result of that, they do all of the defensive strategizing. And it's not because they don't want the help. It's because they can feel that the help in front of them actually isn't honest either. And I would bet that about 40% of the time, particularly with trauma and with concurrent addictions, 40% of the time, this is the reason for resistance. And that almost immediately resistance falls away and collapses in the presence of real curiosity and honesty, even if it's just for a second. It's the exact same barometer you use when raising children. You just have to actually tell the truth. By not telling the truth and being naked, the system becomes abusive, even at the times when the system doesn't mean to be abusive, because there's plenty of those too. If we are to restructure the existing systems, we kind of have to start from the ground up. And we have to present a landscape that comes all the way back from existence itself and is birthed into being from the framework of the way existence moves, the way it informs all of us, and the natural order that it appears in. So it's kind of like, I think of it this way. If you have this giant body of water and you've put it in a box, you've narrowed the bottom and brought it up, you've narrowed the top and brought it down, and you've brought the sides in. And so now you have this box, and there's a ton of movement in that box. It's like that box is like hot. Even if the presentation of the box is deadened, you can't be mistaken that the deadened presentation is still not hot inside. So if we have that going on, not just in the individuals, but in the system itself, then how do we pull the pin out of the center and allow the systems to spill back open into a space in which they can spread out and actually do the work? One of the predominant places that holds that box in place, well, wait, I'm just going to ask you if you guys think you know what that is. What's the one of predominant places that holds that box in place in systems of care? Money, right? Insurance, right? Reimbursement. The DSM, exactly. Yep, 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 exactly. Exactly. I mean, these are the primary drivers, right? Is that we have to comply with them because they are the ones that basically have the power to dole out the information, or in the case of the DSM, the justification or the finances in order to actually pay for the treatment. There's a whole conversation to be had about the way that venture capitalists have moved into the care sector and basically taken over the entirety of it. And what happens when venture capitalists come in is that everything becomes dumbed down and deeply formulaic. They come in, they fire all of the good people because they're too expensive. They keep a temporary leadership, and eventually, over the course of 6 months to a year, you're back into basically a machine. In the addiction world, this is almost all residential treatment at this point. And the small players have almost no chance of competing because their expenses are very high, because their scale is small. So the expenses to run treatment, justify treatment, get approval for treatment, and get low reimbursement, even for the good treatment you're giving, stands against the small player. Actually, sometimes the smallest players are the ones least addicted to the system, but they're carrying the uphill battle of that. So one option that has been talked about is, how do you fund or support the smaller guys to keep being in the game against the bigger guys? And that is one method, but in the last 10 years, I have found that that's too slow. Like, that we won't get there just that way. We probably need to do that, but it's not enough. And so my aim has been really to go for the bigger guys, and principally the legislation and the insurance payer systems and leverage them to actually pay for care that has efficacy that looks very different than what we have now. And to me, this is the way through, is you have to bring these bodies together for a different conversation. They're already in conversation, but the insurance companies and the money are driving the conversation. So, in my estimation, care has to go back to driving that conversation. And so the question is, how do we find a way to make care itself be centered in the care marketplace? Because right now, care in the care marketplace is not the center of it. Neither are the providers, for that matter. Okay, two things I want to say. One is that you can't let the bind of futility stop you. You can't let it stop you in your care, and we can't let it stop us when we think about changing the framework for care itself. The other thing I want to say is there's a huge wave behind this. And so even though the crest or the early part of that wave is barely being felt now, the wave is there. And the way we're seeing that is by people leaving for alternate forms of care, but also the way in which we are seeing so many providers and principal players in these systems leave. People who've been there for decades, like old school people who are like, I'm out if it's like this. So this has been part of my work for years, but really now is like, how do we as that wave really capitalize on this movement and begin really moving it through as a body of energy? Because right now, what we have is people over here, people over here, people over here, people over here, and none of us are really connected very much. Because that's the nature of the game, is that if we're not connected, there's less power. But what I'm saying is that there's a lot of power here. And there's a lot we can and should be tapping into. And there's a lot of goodwill here too that we can and should be tapping into. So I'm always a fan of like shifting the conversation from the hopelessness to actually the action. Where is the action here? Because there's a ton of potential for it. So how do we make that happen? Alternate forms of care often go through the venture capital stage when they follow entrepreneurial ways of profiting after building an yeah. I mean, this is scaling, right? Like this is really our model in capitalism for scaling. And there's a lot of problems with it, but there's a big problem with it now around care. So what if we thought about scaling as being more around access to care, rather than disseminating a watered down model? What if the scale was about up and down and sideways, rather than just about the propagation of like having more money coming in from more people running through the system? If we think about it that way, then it includes a conversation about widening the range, putting programs in every school and in every institution that allows people to learn from a model that will apply to many different medicines and methods, and that can then be implanted as our way of viewing what is happening with people as they come through the front door. What if it is just that baseline? Because scaling in general, we always think about as scaling being profit driven. What if scaling becomes just human driven? What if we try and widen this thing so that it meets the amount of people that are out there that have the need, and it understands that, again, that you can't leave anybody out, and that care is part of a much wider piece of maturation. It isn't a beginning and an end goal. You know how most people still think of care as like you only access the thing when something is wrong, when symptoms are there, when life isn't working. But what if care is just part of the assist that we need to decouple from oppressive systems that we've all been exposed to? What if that's how we define care? What if it stops just being about sickness and it understands that it's meeting the totality of apprehended maturation and sickness that we are seeing societally? Because then that immediately removes the us and them, the binary piece of this that we love to be addicted to, where some people are sick and we'll put them over here so we don't have to look at them, or they need treatment so we'll sink lots of money into that. Listen, you guys, we could like scale this thing like crazy on a quarter of the budget that's what's currently being wasted on care. We spend so much money doing absolutely nothing. Nothing. We throw money away every day in the care world for ridiculous shit because we don't know what to do about the problem. And so when we don't know what to do about the problem, at least in this country, we raise money and we throw it at the problem. Or we pretend the problem isn't there, which is kind of the same thing. So, what if we look at care through a completely different lens? What if existence is tied inexorably to care? What if systemic oppression is not just for Black people and brown people, or neurodivergence, or whatever the flavor of the month is that we're then attaching systemic oppression to? What if we understand that our bodies have been colonized by that and that care demands that it place that in the center? And that that doesn't compete with what we're currently doing in emergency situations or stabilization. What if we understand that all these things have a place, but that they're in the wrong place right now? It's not that they shouldn't all be there, it's that they're all completely out of order. Yeah, what you just touched on, new metrics oriented towards maturation, is exactly what my team and I are kind of working on. Writing those metrics, looking and creating those scales. Because right now there's nothing out there that measures this in this particular way. But that's totally spot on.
Um, One thing about what you were just talking about like maturation and care that strikes me, um, is the way that somebody will come to care from the state of maturation they're currently at with a thought in mind about what getting better would be, which is like, I would be better able to like cope with my problems and like hypothetically, just an example would be like, I'd be better able to coerce myself into these goals that are bad for me, and I would suffer less while I be this person that I'm not, sort of thing. And then they undergo this, potentially they undergo this maturational process through which the goals actually entirely change. And there's a big reorientation that occurs. And I'm just appreciating the like recursive challenge of that as it relates to like the maturational health of like the healthcare system or society or something like that, that it is itself stunted in its
Yes.
maturity. It has goals that it is very sure are the goals, or are the goals that are visible. And so, the same way that you can't necessarily tell a 5-year old where we're headed in adolescence in a way that they can like suddenly be that thing, it's almost, there's like a similar sort of evolution or alchemy that almost needs to happen in this like scaled like systems way. Like, I'm trying to find some orientation where the stuntedness of the system itself is not prohibitive to even like being honest or having goals that make sense there, which has a lot to do with like scale and profitability and how that stuff works. Is like, how do we know it's working or something like that?
Yeah. I think of it as you're right. I mean, I think you can't grow up the system overnight, and
Hmm.
the system has to go through its own kind of dark night, which I
Hmm.
think on some level at the moment it is. Like it's entering pieces of that, which is why this conversation is here. Um, I think you know that I talk about with individuals or with families when they enter that place, and this, of course, happens in the system too. You enter that place, and the knee jerk reaction is, let's put the thing back together, right? And this is the biggest fault of the existing system, especially around trauma and addiction, which is that it's knee jerk rush to put things back together, partially because of reimbursement, but also just because of lack of development and education. It doesn't know that you don't do that. And we can't tolerate the tension in patients and in the system itself in order for actually the right velocity to build in the client to be resilient enough to actually get past that maturational stage. So I think on a meta scale, which is what you're pointing to, how do we do that with the system? And I think we're already doing pieces of it by people looking outside the system for care. In its own way, this migration is fueling some of that developmental movement, because people taking their energy out of it, especially practitioners, skilled practitioners, that is absolutely causing and will continue to cause its own ripple effect because efficacy will go down deeply in the lack of that. So I think there's that piece. There's also the piece about the fact that they don't know what they don't know. And so I really believe wholeheartedly, and I could wind up 10 years from now where we're sitting around and you're like, ah, you were wrong. But I still, and I might be, but I still do really believe wholeheartedly that if we start measuring the right things, and we're able to show efficacy and provability of a model that aims from a maturation lens in the right direction and is deeply, deeply scalable and effective, I totally buy the fact that we're going to be able to pass it. Now, does that mean that every practitioner will be able to do it? No. And does it mean that every insurance company will agree to pay for it? Probably not at the beginning. But I also really believe that there's high net worth individuals and organizations out there that know exactly what we're talking about, and they're looking for opportunities to play with this thing in a different way. Because the reality is, it doesn't matter our journey to getting there. We're getting there. You know, it's kind of the same with individuals. You can be an asshole during your spiritual journey and kick and scream the whole time, but maturation's still going to happen. And it's the same with the systems. It's just that I'm talking about the thing that we won't even think is possibly the thing to talk about for another 10 years. And then when we start talking about it, it'll feel like rocket science. Do you know what I mean? But we'll be like, yeah, but we were actually just having that conversation in 2024. And so the thing is, part of it is that we don't know what's coming if we're like living in a different, but it's coming. It really is. It's coming. And we feel it. And the demand for it is coming because consciousness is demanding it, because consciousness likes to diversify and expand. And if it has been too apprehended, it is going to be like what water does, which is wash away the walls. And so, on some level, that's happening, even though we can't see the results of it tangibly. But I believe we can assist that by bridging it in these ways of like building systems that have sobriety, that connect and are oriented towards what we already have. So there's sense making around it. It's not this crazy woo woo departure. You know what I mean? Like there's some sort of understanding of like, oh, I get it. This makes sense. It's just a different way of looking at it. And I think as we're able to seed that, we're going to really see that movement plug into all of it. But I don't think it's going to be that easy.
suppose what happens is happening in me when thinking about you talking about it being scalable. Like for me at the moment, the kind of stuff you're talking about is only possible in really tiny kind of pockets of genius and people who are really dedicated to maturation and integrity and accountability and all that kind of stuff. Um, Not that there aren't good examples of that, but including the kind of spiritual aspects to it as well, that includes the movement of existence, is very small.
Yeah.
Um, when you talk about scaling, I think about the picture with health and well-being in the UK is very different to in the States. We don't have widespread insurance for health. Obviously, we have a national health service whereby things have to be approved by the body that approves things for application on the NHS. And once you get approved, you're going to get loads of access to loads and loads of people. And so what happened in the counselling world, which is, where my training and experience has been in counsellor education, is, the NHS decided to increase access to psychological therapies. And in doing that, they decided upon CBT as the way to do that. And so they decommissioned a whole load of services across the country that were working already and introduced a CBT model for which you could apply to be a practitioner without any therapeutic training whatsoever. You would get 1 year of training just in applying their model or 2 years, maybe, if you were going to do the higher level stuff. Of course, then there are a load of therapists out of work, and so they then apply for these low paid, low intensity kind of well-being practitioner things. And so scaling to me has been automatic erosion of any
Mm,
authentic, deep, meaningful work that needs to happen. And we see the same things across services to help disabled people back into work, throughout all the job centres throughout the UK. All of those have been taken over by large corporations who are seeking to siphon all of those funds as much as possible and to take, and leave the very least left for the people to actually get their care.
mhm,
And so scaling for me in the current situation feels terrifying
mhm,
as somebody who's been in this professionally, as well as experiencing trying to access care myself for very, very complex needs in a
mhm,
system that has no way of really seeing what's happening in those situations across my family, my personal life, my health in general, physical and mental. And so, yeah, just that terror
mhm.
of hearing you say that scaling, it's like we're not at scaling yet.
Oh, it's
We
gonna
need
mean that
deeper,
you're
maturing pockets. Not the scaling, not the scaling, no.
you're gonna make me come up with a substitute word for scaling. I'm gonna have to
Okay.
throw the word scaling out after this talk, and I'm gonna have to start talking about propagating or like gestating or something. But when I talk about scaling, I mean, I'm actually there you went, Hazel. When I talk about scaling, I'm actually not talking about the capitalist version of scaling. So I
Yeah.
really am talking about kind of the exposure and propagation at a baseline level of a completely different orientation. And I'll say that what you said about like those small pockets, like you started off
Mm,
by saying, what you are speaking about is like these small pockets of genius.
mm,
So that has been the combination of that as variable A and the word scaling as variable B has literally been the last 2 years of my life of been like, how do I solve an equation that looks unsolvable? Like,
mm,
how do I figure out how to marry those two things? Because you're spot on. As soon as anything scales, it basically becomes so watered down and eliminates all the rest of it that it takes over.
yeah.
And at the same time, we desperately need the real thing at a widespread level.
Hey Bree,
Hi.
Do you have any advice for people who are like one-off fringe practitioners who would love to be like plugged into something more multidisciplinary, both because it's so frustrating to only to like see people who need such wider care and only be able to give them the thing I can give them. And I can do the fringe thing of like, well, here's all the other resources I recommend you checking out and all these other parts of the world, but like, but also just for my own like diversification of education. Um, I know it's a big question. I don't even know if it makes sense to ask it now, but
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, it's why I didn't train a bunch of practitioners, exactly what I said at the beginning, because if they don't have a place to like all work in the right kind of system, what's the point? Do you know what I mean? Like you can be epic as a practitioner, but you're still kind of isolated and working alone. Um, I think there's also the piece that, like, if you're not a practitioner whose work is paid for by insurance, there's also limitations to your income in some ways. And so, I'll say how I solved, I'll just say this first, which is that I endeavored to try to solve this back in Vermont when I still had the clinic. It was definitely really front and center for me. I mean, the piece that I did solve was having the multidisciplinary team and the centralized language and the unified treatment delivery. And that was big alone. But the piece I was really trying to solve for was like, insurance doesn't pay for this or this or this. And so, how do we keep people working at a rate in which they have enough active income to do their work? And how do we go outside of insurance to do it? Because right now, insurance is not interested in covering. So, the first thing we did was we opened that nonprofit arm, and that really helped. Um, but ultimately, what I was really aiming towards there is that Vermont, a couple of other states have this too, but Vermont passed this like legislative bill or whatever where they could have something called a medical home. And a medical home basically is where a primary care physician is the lead. It's basically a primary care physician office with a bunch of other like offerings. Like there might be a psychologist there, there might be a body worker there, there might be a nutritionist there. And so those were like available for some reimbursement that it wasn't if you were not designated a medical home. So I barked up that tree for a while and it wasn't right for us. But the third piece that would have been right if I had kept the clinic open is that there was a way to bundle services into a day code. And that day coding basically meant that, like, if you saw, Jane, if you, Jane, saw Jane and you saw Tom and you saw Sabrina on the same day, but those three patients also saw a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and our primary care doctor, we could bill this one day code and you could get paid from that as well as everybody else. So there are workarounds here. You just have to be creative. That's on the system end. On the practitioner end, the best suggestion, short of you better fucking come work for me when I have a place for you because I want you, but short of that, and three of you, but short of that, um, you should form a group of people. Like find a group of people who are in your area who are doing similar work and like think about sharing office space, think about sharing caseloads, like think about forming like in space coalitions. Um, yeah, it can be really helpful, especially for patients. Most patients come in and they desperately want the opportunity to have people who work together, even if those people aren't really working together, but just that you guys have lunch together. You know what I mean? Or like you share information with the psychologist that's in that area or whatever. So that's my best suggestion, short of like actually having a real place with a real system.
Hi. Hi. Thanks
Hi.
so much for giving this. I just wanted to kind of like to say that I'm a current medical trainee. I'm in med school, and what you said has really been resonating with me. I've felt like intensely alone, and very much that sort of like lack of vitality as I've sort of had to do this, go there. No one really asks like who I am, what my priorities are, how I'd like to learn. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to say I appreciate you kind of like opening this space um and also I just wonder if you have any advice kind of like on the opposite end of what advice do you have for someone that's like embedded in these very systems that have all these issues, and who's who maybe has the opportunity to like get into places, has a licensure that like whose goal would be to like open these sorts of doors from the inside, but again, like I've run into like so much institutional like baggage, it's like you can't talk about like meditation or psychedelics, let
Mm-hmm.
alone like just talk about like existence. People look at you like you have three heads and then you get a weird eval.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I'm just curious if you've seen anything that people have done or have any advice in that capacity.
Yeah, so I'm on my fifth year now of teaching to the fellows and residents of the child psychiatry program at Dartmouth Medical School.
Cool.
And every year that I teach there, um, it's always really interesting. But every year that I teach there, there's at least one psychiatrist in the room who raises their hand, sometimes several, who are like, this is all great. And like, we are, I teach my eating disorder model. So
Nice.
I'm teaching a very specific risky population model that has pretty shitty efficacy on the whole as far as treatment. And a part of that is not because of the good people in it, it's because we don't really understand the true heart of what's happening in eating disorders and that they're a deep reflection of everything I've spoken about with non-existence. Um, so when I present it that way, pretty much there's always people in the audience who are like, "Oh my God," and people who are like, "That's all great, but like we're here and like we can't talk about this, and like, can you get us out?" Every time. Every time. And it like, it's Dartmouth Medical School, so it's like people from all over the world, right? And a lot of times the non-American ones, they're even more like, get us the fuck out. So, but the thing is that like I always say, look, you guys are leaving here and you're going to go out into the field. And when you go out into the field, I know you have massive loans to pay back, and that is an obstacle for many, many people. But I always say you have a choice to come get educated about a model that will incorporate the kind of work you're doing as a psychiatrist in a way that will make you feel more effective and more honest in delivering that work. And that is at least step one that you can do. Finally, something broke. And last year, one of the psychiatrists who was at my second talk in January, she reached out to me and she's like, I was just at your talk. I have an elective this semester. Can you be my elective? And I said, yeah, I guess I can if they say yes. And so they said yes. And she spent like a semester with me studying my model. And I got to tell you, it was excruciating for her. Not because she couldn't get the model, but because she felt so much unbelievable pressure to comply. And because she was still there, I want to learn this stuff from you, but I have to be really fucking careful. And so we processed a lot of that. She came to me 2 months after graduation. She touched base with me and she said, I just wanted to circle back with you. She's like, your work saved my relationship with my partner. She's
Mm.
like, we just moved. I have my first job. She was crying And I thought I did a shit job because I'm like, we have like 10,000 things we didn't cover in that semester. And she was like, no, you don't understand. You changed the way I understood my profession. She's like, I was ready to walk out. So I think this is the thing, is the first place is understanding how psychiatry and how medication and how the role of being a psychiatrist can in a healthy way fit into the totality of the system, and how you can hold that framework and be a representative for it. I mean, the idea is at some point I would love to put this model in every med school
Yeah.
because it doesn't compete with what's there. It just really explains what's there in a way in which what's there isn't so damn dominant and narrow.
Hey, Bree, this has been great. Um, it reminds me of the time I rolled out an emotional resilience program to a load of frontline workers who dealt with troubled people in low value housing that was owned by this association. And I rolled it out to about 300 people. It was like a day and a half's training in how to manage your own well-being. And the challenge of touching the first, say, 150 people was just magical. I mean, people just opened and word spread. And then the last 100 or so kind of came because it became obligatory. It took off so well. And they just, yeah, they pushed back on it and didn't engage it because there was no buy-in because they didn't want to improve.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw like the resistance. Once I got through about 100, 150 people, the remaining 150 started to tail off. And the opposition started to build where it was becoming obligatory. So people have to really want it and be hungry for that change. But what really struck me was when you mentioned existence is not the basis of these models, and they're kind of on the wrong beat. Their ladder's on the wrong wall. And you mentioned about 5 or 6 categories or themes of existence. I just wondered if you could speak to those a little bit more, whether it's appropriate to say anything now, because that feels like the meat. And then you also mentioned your client who benefited from the silence, going into the silence. And I guess that felt fascinating as the opposition to existence and the silence, like those two feel very much in relationship, but also they happen at different stages.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can say all the things that are in my head. So the first thing I want to say in response to is the motivation. Um, and one, there will always be a certain degree of people who come for care or offered care or offered a way that at that particular time they're not interested in that way. And that's just fine. And I would say that of that percentage, if we were to say that percentage was 40, and I'm just pulling that number out, I would say at least 20% of that 40% isn't interested because the way we're presenting it isn't informed by the end game enough. And what I mean by that is it's not embodied in the people who are performing it. So we are usually selling something that is conceptual. The idea, what happens when you sell something conceptual is that either A, you have to become a kick-ass salesman for it, but you better follow up. This is what we have in addiction treatment right now. We have kick-ass salespeople for conceptual recovery. Or if you can't be a kick-ass salesperson, you better be able to embody a language that goes beyond just the intellectual version of it. So part of the problem is we're peddling something that's a piece of paper. Do you know what I mean? Like it's as thin and as tangible as a piece of paper. And we're saying to people, here, this piece of paper is what we're going to give you to get to this other place. But they can't feel it. They can't feel it in their bodies. And as soon as people feel it in their bodies, you don't have to tell them as much. You don't have to sell anything because their body's already going with you. And so I would say of that 40%, it's usually the 20%. And this is the challenge with, here's that word again, scaling, because how do you get a widespread body of people to embody the thing that actually takes a long time to develop? And so now I'm going to skip to your next question about the void and around existence, which is where I have been working in this very narrow space where all of these questions come together that seem like you can never answer them with one answer, right? Because that's dumb, because we can't do this thing. And so the corner in there that I keep coming to is, well, you have to propagate the embodiment of existence. And you have to do it in a way in which, even if, so you have to do it through multiple ways. You have to do it intellectually because we love to understand something, right? We don't buy something that we can't understand. We don't buy it on feeling alone, except maybe we might be buying a president on feeling alone. But that's a whole other thing. Like, I think we might be voting on just our emotions. But anyway, so I think, like, in general, it has to come through the intellectual body, it has to come through the emotional body, and it has to come through the experiential body. And if you can hit all three of those things, then you're beginning to basically pollinate the space with a possibility of something that may not have been considered. And what that does is it creates an opening for you to enter in and show what you have. The bigger challenge becomes, how do you do that and create something that is deliverable, replicable, and still deeply effective? And so far, we haven't been able to see a lot of examples of that, right? Once you get to that place, it's like it just dies. It goes there to die. So this is kind of what the equation I'm starting to solve. A piece of it has to do with absolutely touching the space of zero. And it has to do with touching it not by force, but by the fact that that space of zero is always here. It's just that we don't register it. Our perception is directed outside of it. And so if you can introduce that space as always being here and always being in ownership of the person you are sitting with, you aren't giving them that space. They already are that space. So it's about really moving with perception and consciousness and light in order to understand the way physics works. When you understand that, people can touch it. And you don't need any psychology for it, or very little. I'm not saying none, but much, 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 so much less than we're doing now. So much less. Because we think that the interpretive will get us there. The interpretive doesn't get us to zero. We need the interpretive for other pieces of this, but it won't lead us to zero. Zero already exists. Existence always exists. So we have to register all those bodies, all those fields. And I mean, you already know pieces of this because you've been exposed to my, but yes. If you're at all interested in like training in this model, there's going to be a cohort of a small application only cohort of multidisciplinary practitioners. So this will intentionally be a cross-disciplinary training. It will be offered at about half the price of what future trainings will be, because it will be asking those kind of hand-chosen folks to begin propagating this model in their disciplines and fields. And I'll have more information about that. Probably right now it's going to be a 6-month online, partially in person training. It's going to be kick-ass, and probably not more than 20 people. Oh, okay. I thought of something else I wanted to say. Um, it's kind of like we're at the perfect time to do this. And that's because the perfect time to have a renaissance is when the world is at war. And so I think the thing is, you get to decide how you're going to hold that. You know what I mean? Like how you hold that binary of the fact that it is probably the most globally contentious around everything than it has been in at least my lifetime. And there is also the most recognition of powerlessness on a global level than there probably has ever been during my lifetime. If you look at that through the lens of real reality, it can flatten you. Because what we are trying to contend with here, what I'm talking about today, it's everything. It's not just in care. Care just happens to be one of the places we encounter, and we go to encounter the like windfall from what I just spoke about. So care matters because it's where we go when we're really struggling to be with life as it is. That's why it's so principal to this model. Not because I have a care model. I have a spiritually developmental model. Care is one form of this. It just happens to be the thing that like we all need in order to get past some of that apprehended maturation. So you can get really caught up in that and stay in the powerlessness, or you can recognize that when things fall apart, there's a massive opening. And that in fact, that is the time when there is the most opening. Because the structure of reality has a kind of ever opening tear in it at the moment. And what I mean by that is the way that we have endorsed the structure of reality to be solid and true, we are now in massive doubt and revealing around. And so because of that, there's a place to step in. I think it was like 3 or 4 months ago, I woke up one day and I called somebody who was on my team and I said to them, I feel like I'm looking at a war and I'm gonna go walk naked into the center of it and sit the fuck down. And it's like that, like it's the opening is there. So it's like this is the time to use what you know to get informed where you want to be informed and to feel empowered to carry your own wisdom out into the world. Because it's not like none of it's going to wait for any of us. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not waiting, it's here. I mean, the real test is how much we'll be able to tolerate not just rushing to put it back together. Because the way we've had it is over. And because we can't accept when things are over, we try to patch them back together to make the past the present. And so it's that kind of ferreting into this acceptance that like that version of reality, it's not going to be anymore.
Well,
Okay, Yoko, exactly. Okay. Okay. Love you guys. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for the amazing work that you all do. Every one of you does amazing work in this room. So thank you. And be good. Okay.